Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. With the recent announcement of an agreement between Facebook and Australia over the payment to news organizations for posted or shared content, the appropriate role of government regulation of these platforms has entered a new phase. What is the obligation of Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms to compensate for content? What is the role of the state in regulating? Joining us to discuss are Sinclair Davidson. He is a professor of economics at RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia. And David Clement, or Clement, doesn't matter. I get both of those too, but he is no relation to me. He is the North America Affairs Manager of Consumer Choice Center in Washington, D.C., although he is coming to us because this is COVID from Oakville, Ontario. Welcome to both of you.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
My pleasure, certainly. It's my pleasure to both of you. Well, we're going to start with Professor Davidson because he's traveled the greatest distance to get here, perhaps. Tell us your perspective on this Australia-Facebook battle and the deal that was reached.
In my view, this is basically a government shakedown of new business models to compensate their friends in the media, disguised as a principled argument over payment for content. So it's been disguised as competition policy, but it's actually crony capitalism. I think once you dig down into the detail of this, most people should quite rightly be appalled by what the Australian government has done over the last 2 years, and particularly these deals that have now been struck. Pure disgraceful, trying to tax successful businesses to prop up failing businesses. It's a horrible thing, and I think everybody should immediately write to their members of Congress, their parliamentarians, and actually say to them, we don't want to be seeing this going forward.
David, you've got the right of rebuttal or the right of agreement?
I 100% agree with Professor Davidson, and I actually think that if the government is getting involved, so I mean, one big problem is freedom of contract. It's essentially forcing these platforms into contracts with news agencies. But what's really puzzling to me is that it seems that they have the relationship backwards. So when you post something on social media, let's say Twitter, which you're very often on, Tony, and you post a link to a news story, you're sending that news agency free leads. And every time someone clicks on that link and ends up on a newspaper website, whether it be the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, they earn revenue based on the ads they sell on their website, and it gives them an opportunity to sell subscriptions. And so for me, it seems like the Australian government, and unfortunately our Canadian government with Minister Guilbeault, is looking at this and essentially forcing Facebook to pay for sending free leads to news agencies. And I just can't understand how that benefits anyone, consumers especially. It only benefits the news agencies who will be getting these payments.
Well, if I could add to
Please.
that, Tony, it's actually, I think it's actually even slightly worse than what David has described, because when you go to a newspaper and you read an article, very often right next to the article will be a button that you can click, that you can send that article. So the news agency actually facilitates you sending this news article via Twitter or Facebook to your friends. And then they say, oh, and by the way, we think Google and Facebook or Twitter should pay us for the privilege of this. It's quite shocking, actually. The Google story is even better. One of the Australian journalists was using Google to search for news articles in his own newspaper. And if that was happening under the new model, Google would have to pay for a journalist to seek his own articles in his own newspaper because their internal search function is so terrible. So the exact backwardness of this is so apparent, and how media actually benefit from this so much is so apparent. And yet, I don't know if they've bamboozled the government into going along with them, or this is genuine crony capitalism, and yet we are today in this exactly backward situation that David described.
Well, there's a lot to break down here, and we're just about to go to a break. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back with our guests after this break. Stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, as always, Tony Clement, here with David Clement, no relation, of the Consumer Choice Center, which is housed at Washington, D.C., although he's still in Canada. With the COVID happening on both sides of the border, it's hard to travel back and forth for sure. But we also have as a great special guest, Professor Sinclair Davidson. He's a professor of economics at the RMIT University at Melbourne, Australia. Gentlemen, thanks again. I just want to wrap my mind around this, but maybe I go to you first, Professor. But we started to unpack this a little bit. I, as a Twitter user or a Facebook user or whatever, make a choice independently of anyone to share an article, which I did this morning from the Times of London, because it had to do with COVID and some of the new research that was pertaining to their vaccination efforts. So I make a choice that is completely divorced from the platform. The platform didn't know I was going to make that choice. They didn't have any say in whether I made that choice or not. And then by virtue of that, somehow they're now financially responsible to the Times of London. Is that the essence of the issue here, Professor?
That is the argument. Let me give you a slightly different analogy. If you had had a physical copy of the Times of London, which is a great newspaper, if you had a physical copy of that newspaper and you'd cut it out, put the cutting into an envelope and posted it to a friend, the logic of this argument would be that the post office would have to pay money to the Times of London. Now, we all immediately recognize that that is a completely absurd situation. And yet all of a sudden people get bamboozled with new technology. And also the Australian government have been quite disgraceful in sort of leaning into the techlash. You know, the whole argument that somehow all these new things are bad for us, because new things are always bad for us, you know. So that they've leaned into this whole anti-progress, anti-technology approach in order to bail out the legacy media who to genuinely have actually lost advertising revenue from their cross-subsidization model. And the correct solution to all of this is, of course, is to say to the legacy media, you guys need to come up with a new profitable business model, not actually leech off your more successful competitors.
David, I know you've been following the debate here in Canada. You mentioned our heritage minister and some of his musings. Where do you see this going?
Well, I'm hoping that they can see the disaster that was the negotiation process between tech companies and news agencies and really see the devastating impact that that can have on ordinary Canadians. And I'll give you an example. So in that negotiation process, Facebook stopped allowing their users to share links to Australian news providers. Somewhat in an act of protest, but also to highlight what would happen really if the government were to pursue this policy full freight. Now, imagine only being able to get your news from picking the individual news site that you want to go to, and then multiply that irritation by the fact that we're in a global pandemic and social media, which has certainly had its issues with controlling misinformation, is arguably the largest source of spreading public health information about how to deal with this virus. And so we're living in a time where social media is, in comparison to nothing else we've ever seen, distributing important public health information for free. And now these news agencies have maybe successfully lobbied the government in Canada to try and get a piece of the pie that isn't theirs.
Sinclair, I want you to answer as well, but also take into account the way it was portrayed was that the Australian government won and Facebook lost. Is that accurate too?
I don't think so. Certainly in the Australian media, that is how it's been playing out. But in actual fact, this has been about a 2-year process where our competition authority, the Australian Competition Consumer Council Commission, brought out a report where they wanted a whole range of things, including having access to Facebook and Google's algorithms. That's more or less their core business models. They wanted them to simply hand them over to a random government authority here in Australia. And they wanted this negotiation model and a whole bunch of other things. About 6 weeks ago, Google ran an experiment where they actually shut off Australia from some of their media searches. And the government very quickly entered into negotiations with Google and changed the things that Google didn't like.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust talking about social media platforms and the rush to tax and regulate and charge. Professor Davidson, I had to interrupt you, but please continue with your thought.
So I was explaining before the break how Google and Facebook actually more or less made good on their promises to exit the Australian market if the government actually went ahead with their plans. Google ran an experiment, and about 3 weeks ago, Facebook actually switched off all news media content in Australia. And our government claimed to be shocked and surprised, despite the fact that the risk of this was written into the explanatory memorandum to the Act in Parliament, which just goes to show politicians don't read what they vote on. But nonetheless, they switched off for about a week. And again, very quickly, our treasurer, so I imagine the equivalent of the Minister of Finance, but the second highest ranking person in the government after the Prime Minister, got on the phone to Mark Zuckerberg, frantic phone calls, about 6 phone calls in the matter of 3 or 4 days. And more or less, the government backed down on a whole bunch of things that Facebook didn't want in the Act. So what we actually now have is an Act of Parliament that went through both houses of Parliament that effectively doesn't really actually apply to either Google or Facebook. So the government can say, oh, we passed our legislation, and Google and Facebook can say, yeah, but it doesn't really apply to us. So in actual fact, we have more redundant legislation on the books that at some point in the future can be used to randomly beat up tech companies, which of course in and of itself is yet another problem in this area. The fact of the matter is that Google was rolling out a new product anyway, and they were going to pay for media content anyway. And Facebook have kind of come along the lines of, we will pay for stuff that we want to put up. Now, if you are conspiracy theory minded, you could actually say, well, isn't this the case that effectively Google and Facebook now can own media companies without having to buy their stocks on the market? That they will curate what they want, and they will pay a fee, which they will have negotiated more or less at arm's length. But I imagine over time, we will actually find more and more media companies are simply paying for that Google product to put into that Google product, and are simply paying to put into those Facebook products. So in actual fact, this notion of an independent media may very quickly disappear under this regulatory schmozzle, which the Australian government has introduced and is being exported to your country, Canada, and also the European Union is looking at it.
And on top of that,
Please,
I
David.
think in regards to legacy media on that note, there is a potentially crippling effect on second and third tier publishers. So much of this conversation in Canada is surrounding Torstar, Postmedia, Globe and Mail, etc. But what does this do, or how does this apply for independent media? And so many people have rightly said that local news is falling. It's relatively disappearing. But what would happen if a local news provider now wants to enter the market and with an online platform, and now they're going to be potentially, if Guilbeault follows through with his full pledge, now have this uncomfortable relationship and hostility, and basically get lumped in with these legacy providers who have been lobbying successfully for this. So there is a externality here that a lot of people don't talk about, where it could create a more consolidated media market, which a lot of people would have concerns with.
See, this is the issue as well, and I had a guest on earlier talking about antitrust or anti-competitive behavior. Is this part of the nub of the real problem, that it's hard to get entry into social media to tackle Twitter or to tackle Facebook, and so they rule the roost? Professor, why don't you start with that?
I think there's a lot of hard thought that needs to go into the application of historical antitrust principles to these new platforms. Bear in mind, Twitter and Facebook and Google, at the consumer side of things, give away their product more or less for free, and they charge advertising. Or they charge some sort of access, or they make use of our data, which we give them more or less, again, in exchange for these goods and services. Now, a lot of people say, oh, goodness me, they've got control of our data. But to be quite honest, my data is actually fairly uninteresting. And I'm happy to give it to Google in return for an email account, and happy to give it to Facebook for the privilege of keeping in contact with my relatives all over the world.
And we're back with Boom and Bust with our guest talking about social media platforms. Professor Davidson, we were talking about market power, and you were just making the point that they give a lot for their market share. So please continue with that thought.
They do. Historically, antitrust is about protecting consumers from predation, protecting them from paying too high prices. What we actually have is these new business models where consumers pay nothing. They get these products for free. I get an email account from Google. I get contact with my family and relatives all over the world from Facebook, and hello, Nana in Kelowna. So these are great, great products to consumers. And so the antitrust people, the anti-tech people have to start telling stories about how these companies are exploiting their own competitors. Well, in a capitalist economy, you're supposed to try and beat your own competitor in order to better meet consumer needs. So what the anti-tech people are doing is trying to pervert the current antitrust provisions, which protect consumers, to protecting competitors. Now, this is always something that we've argued against. And antitrust and competition policy is not there to protect competitors. It's there to protect consumers. And Facebook, Google, Twitter do a great job with their consumers. They are always innovating to provide better experiences to their consumers. We should welcome these companies and celebrate these companies. What a fantastic pro-consumer job they're doing.
David, do you want to chime in on this from your perspective?
Yeah, just one other issue with the claim. I mean, we've seen it in the headlines here in Canada, is that Facebook is somehow stealing content from news providers. And I don't think anything that couldn't be further from the truth. And that really is because when you post a link on Facebook or Twitter, all you have is the link and then what would largely be considered fair use, which is a snippet about the article. And so they're not actually reposting full content so that users never go to a particular news agency's website. And so the whole thing just seems quite dubious to me. And as Professor Davidson has rightly pointed out, it feels like crony capitalism. And you then multiply that by the fact that we already subsidize our media industry in Canada. I believe it's to the tune of something like $565 million. And so all of this just becomes really puzzling to me as to why this is a good idea. And I think the Australian negotiation, shakedown, whatever we would like to call it, it should send a clear signal to Minister Guilbeault's office that this is just not worth pursuing.
So, David, where do you see this going?
Unfortunately, I think that Minister Guilbeault, who is rather steadfast in his views on all topics, it seems, is likely going to proceed unless there is a pushback from Canadians, because obviously, as you would know, Tony, you have to take into account the will of the voters who are consumers. And so I do think that there can be pushback at the consumer level who say, this isn't a good idea. Australia is a failed model and a failed approach, and this is the wrong way to address whatever the concerns the government may have. And so I'm hopeful that consumers can start to express those concerns directly with their members of parliament and with Minister Guilbeault's office.
Professor Davidson, we've got just under a minute left. Where do you see things going in Australia?
I kind of think, unfortunately, this does have a lot of acceptance. There was an outbreak of patriotism. Those evil foreigners are trying to bully us, when in actual fact, it was the nation state of Australia bullying private companies in a shakedown. It's absolutely disgraceful, and the message should get out that we don't want crony capitalism. This is bad for consumers. It's actually bad for voters and taxpayers too. Crony capitalism is something which is we think about in third world countries, not places like Australia and Canada. So generally speaking, write to your member of parliament today telling them this is a bad idea.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for being on the program. Very interesting for our viewers. And I'm sure this topic will not go away. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to thank my guests from Canada and also Australia, talking about the future of these platforms and the nature of the news content and who should be paying and who should be regulating. This is the tip of the iceberg, as you're well aware, dear viewers, and it'll be a topic that we'll have to come back to as things gestate here in Canada as well. So stay with us. We'll be having more of this topic of conversation in the future. Thanks for being with us today.